Welcome to this webinar on building bridges, how to leave and join organisations well. I'm Nisa Chitakasem, and your main presenters today are Simon North, founder of Position Ignition, and Claire Norman, our very special guest for today's webinar. Claire specialises in leadership development. She designs and delivers award-winning leadership programs, and we are really delighted to have her with us today. Simon met Claire 8 years ago on the same coach training program, and through his senior level roles as HR director and managing director, and through his coaching work here, he has a lot of experience in working with people transitioning across organizations. Both Claire and Simon will be sharing their insight and experiences in today's session. Okay, so welcome Claire and Simon. Do please tell us more about what we'll be covering today.
Thank you, Nisa, and hello, everybody. Before I give you an overview of what the webinar will cover, I wonder whether you knew this statistic. The Centre for Creative Leadership, many of you may have heard of this august body based in the States, but also with offices around the world. In some recent research, they reckon that about 40% of people who are hired into senior and high-impact roles either get demoted or resign or get fired within their first 18 months. I wonder if that's a surprise to you. It certainly was to me. The expectations that we have when we hire somebody are usually high. That's not a surprise. But what underlies it is that we're interested, very interested in them having the same level of skills that those who are already incumbent in the business or organization have, the same levels of understanding, and that they're culturally savvy. In other words, that they actually fit in. In other research I've seen, more than 50, sometimes greater than 60% of people who come from outside organizations actually fail in that same period of time. Now, what we're going to explore is, why is this important? It's important, obviously, from an economic point of view. I'm going to talk about that in a moment. It's also important from a disruption point of view, not just the opportunity cost in terms of what isn't being done in the business, but the impact that it can have on your internal resource. These individuals that we bring in are a precious resource, and we know that it is a risky undertaking to bring them in. So that's, if you like, a precursor to what it is we want to talk about in building bridges, how you leave and join organizations well. We would all agree, I'm sure, that being a good leaver is paramount these days. In the UK economy, a very senior, very heavyweight person has just left a chief executive job in the financial sector. And it was interesting, alongside the massive pay package that this person is getting for leaving, that it actually had in the broadsheets, they were a good leaver. It really does affect the organization and the individual to a huge amount these days, more so maybe than it has ever done. And we'll talk about why. The emotion that is involved in the journey and in the processes of this journey, both for the individual and those affected within the organizations that they join, is another facet which we will be covering, as indeed is managing the risks and getting the return on investments right. Endings and new beginnings, as William Bridges talked about, and that neutral zone in between, getting it right, understanding what the challenges are, both personal, logistical, professional, all of these things really matter. Here's another gobsmacking statistic. The cost of replacing a top executive is conservatively put at 5 times the previous incumbent's total cash component. When I read that, I always thought, really? Show me. Where's the proof? And actually, the statistic comes from a guy called Dr. Brad Smart, who you may well have heard of. He's written and taught and lectured and coached quite extensively in the States and internationally, wrote a book called Top Grading, which he's probably best known for, but also an ebook which I was looking at recently on avoiding the costly mishire, as he calls it, the mishire. So what is it about? Well, he basically has put together a toolkit which is not that different from other things you may have heard of. It's about differentiating talent at the point at which you recruit them. What he says is that most organizations only get the top performers that they want about a quarter of the time. And that may well explain the Centre for Creative Leadership research number. Because the cost of a mishire, he reckons, he's had evidence of working with 50 different companies where the mishire of a manager earning $100,000 was, he estimates, $1.5 million. That's 15 times the base compensation level. And there's plenty of evidence in his work that, when he says conservatively 5 times, it is conservatively because there's plenty of evidence that it's a lot higher than that. So you might think, well, where are these costs? What lies behind it? What's the impact? Well, they're in pretty obvious places when you really scrutinize it. Compensation, the risks associated with another hiring, but the hiring costs, even though if you use headhunters, they'll have to contractually waive their costs for part of that search, but they've got to go and do it all again. The disruption costs to the organization and to the individual, the opportunity costs, the severance costs. And what do we mean by our opportunity costs in this sense? It's the customer expectation, the sales that haven't come as a result of this new person arriving, the team performance because they have not actually been led in the way that you would expect. And this one, I think, is absolutely massive. The expectations of the best people in the organization that they're about to get a really important senior colleague, and then it doesn't happen for whatever reason. Their expectations are not met. What are they going to do when they're mainly interested in working with other good people? Claire, over to you.
Thanks, Simon. So let's talk about managing the risk. Simon has alluded to many of those risks already. So we have the risk of attrition, people either leaving or being fired. We have the risk of underperformance, people not stepping up into this new context, not being as significant in this context as they were in previous contexts. We have the risk of derailment, as CCL said. So perhaps that's a difficulty building and leading a team. It might be difficulty in changing or adapting to this new situation. It might be a failure to meet business objectives, or problems with interpersonal relationships, or even too narrow a functional orientation. All of those things are the kinds of derailments that CCL talks about. But those are certainly risks to the business, and also there is a personal risk here for individuals. So people risk being rejected by the new people around them, and they have a real risk to their self-esteem and their personal brand if they aren't able to make a good go of transitioning well. So we have plenty of risks running in the background here. So I alluded to the idea of being successful in a previous organization and perhaps not being so successful in this new organization. So really what we want to help people to do is to bring the best of who they are to this new business context to enable both themselves and the business to grow. So they've been hired because they were good in that previous context, but of course they knew who to call on, they knew how to get things done, they had figured it out in that old context. Moving into a new context, there are so many variables, things to figure out. And so people really need to have some support in helping them to figure out how to shine in this new place, this new culture with new people. Everything about this place is new.
We actually have 3 case studies during this presentation, and the first is this. I want to give you a bit of context. Imagine a senior executive who is feeling in great space about a year and a half, 2 years ago. Excellent role, excellent organization, relationships were absolutely terrific, and most importantly, could see a future within this setup until that moment when it goes wrong. And it goes wrong quite often for us these days because of nothing we've done, but just because on the bigger map things start get changing. And in this particular case, it was a large organization, an international organization, wanting to change, restructure two of their companies, pull them into one. And the result of this for the individual was that it all ended rather badly. And they went from sort of thinking it was absolutely fabulous to this is just wrong very quickly. And that can happen. And what they did was they took an interim role really to maintain career momentum. And I think looking back on it, it was probably the right thing for them to do. They were offered the opportunity through somebody that they had worked with and for before, and it all was, just happy landing. And it went pretty well. They never felt that they needed to or wanted to move on too fast, but neither did they really want the full-time opportunity when it was offered, and it was offered because this individual's very, very good. What actually happened to them, and again this happens to people a lot, they found a new opportunity and they rather rushed into it. They rushed in for the title, for the kudos, for the package, for that whole sort of seduction process that goes on when people are really interested in you coming and working for them. And what you don't do as an individual is do your due diligence very well on the organization that you're moving into. And that's what happened here. There were a raft of things that actually cropped up in retrospect, as it were, that they just missed on the going in. But probably the most important of all was their reporting line. They felt that they were going to have greater influence, greater space, the chance to do more than actually transpired. And that's where they lost the best of themselves, as Claire was saying. It's so easy for us to get put into a context or maneuver ourselves unwittingly into a context where we do lose the best of ourselves. And in this particular case, the individual is on the move again, this time I think with far greater attention to detail and far better at really spotting the important things. But I think one point of this case study is it takes two to tango. It is the individual on the one hand and it's the organization on the other. And you have to deal with both sides of it. And as we go through the rest of this webinar, you will see us trying very hard to look at it from both sides and to get that sort of balance. And as Claire was saying, making certain that individuals are well supported into their new roles. Because one of the things that happens all the time is that we make assumptions, presumptions about things and about people. We make, for example, the assumption that, you're quite senior now, the more often that you do this, the easier it gets. Well, maybe, but what's for sure is that the stakes get higher. The risks that you were hearing about get higher. The contexts are different, but the expectations are higher. Secondly, you're more experienced. You must have the capability to cope better. Yeah, maybe, but not necessarily. Because who says that resilience comes with age? Yeah? Do all of us feel more confident and comfortable in every facet of our lives as we get older? I don't think that's necessarily true. We might get wiser as time goes on, but I'm not certain that we can assume that our resilience does. Thirdly, it's just a change of role. It's just a change of organization. What's the problem? Well, why is this different? Why is this different for us? What is the opportunity here for us to actually feel that we're diminishing the challenge ahead of ourselves, leading ultimately to us feeling diminished ourselves if we actually get it wrong? So we have to be really careful that we respect this process and that we don't see it as just a slam dunk and that it's that easy. And finally, we just sort of say, well, what do you mean it's a psychological process? Path to that. Well, we live in primarily a thinking world. If you think of MBTI, we're more T than F in our thinking, for those of you who are familiar with this. What that means is that we use reason and we use logic and we use a scientific measured way of looking at hard numbers and hard things a lot better than we do the intangibles. And I think the intangibles is a big issue in assumptions, because if you're following the way that the economy is moving and growing, you'll see that the valuation of businesses is becoming less tangible and more intangible. And we are in intangible territory here when we're thinking about building those bridges from one organisation to another.
So building on Simon's suppositions about being more senior, of course everybody has an effect on the people around them, but the more senior you are coming into an organisation, the more of a ripple effect you're going to have. So everybody is looking out for your every word, your every action. There's going to be a ripple effect on your personal performance, on the people around you, and of course on the business. So everybody is watching you. And if you get it wrong, that can leave a really sour taste for the people around you. Well, why did we invest so heavily in this new person? What are they bringing to the party? So this ripple effect is important to get right, as opposed to having that sour taste in the mouth. And making sure that senior people can be resilient as they go through the transition and can make the psychological adjustments that Simon was talking about there. So in order to help them to get this right, we believe that integration coaching is absolutely essential and can really help with all of those things that we've talked about so far, and can decrease the chances of all those risks happening that we talked about before. So these are the kinds of things that might come up in integration coaching. Certainly the ending, how to make a good ending, and this is not only about the practicalities of making a good ending, but also the psychological closure and having a good closure so that you can then have a good beginning. Getting clarity, so this is clarity of role, what are the expectations of me? And of course, we've had lots of discussions in the interview process, but there will be new and different stakeholders as a person joins an organisation. So there needs to be clarity from all of those stakeholders, and expectation management, relationship management, figuring out who are the people who matter that you need to meet their expectations. There's also something about being authentic, so being true to yourself, and at the same time being significant in this new organisation. So this is a real balancing act of being yourself, bringing your best self into this new context, as we talked about before, and making a significant contribution into that new context. Simon and I, before the call started, we were talking about imposter syndrome and how people often feel in a new context, or perhaps they've been promoted, that they feel the self-doubt, am I really worthy of this new job? And getting that balance of authenticity and significance right is going to help people to snuff out the little voices of the imposter syndrome. But then there's things like organising yourself well in order to be effective, and to some people that comes more naturally than it does to others, so there may be some help needed around that. Figuring out what success looks like, stepping up to challenges rather than waiting for others to hold their hand, bringing the best of who they are to have these successes, making the best decisions to suit this culture and context and for the long-term success of the business. So there's a lot that you can cover in integration coaching, as I said, ranging from the ending through kind of a no man's land of insecurities and not knowing, right through to making great beginnings. And by the way, beginnings don't necessarily happen on the first day of a job. Now, I say that, but what I really mean is psychological beginnings, actually feeling like you're making a beginning. It's very different from starting a new job. We use coaching because although these are seasoned executives, these people likely know what they should do intellectually, but actually they need a bit of help to support them through that. So the coach doesn't tell, teach or advise the individual, but asks powerful questions that facilitate the individual's process of discovery, of learning and advancing the action. And they also can work on a growth plan for the next stage once the coaching program has finished. But this picture shows you that psychological shift that the coach can help a person to move through. If I start with homeostasis, so this is our tendency as human beings to actually want to remain where we are. We like stability, we like equilibrium, we're not that keen on change. So very often we will put up with a situation even though it's not the right thing for us, it's not perfect. And so sometimes the coaching can start well before a person has made a decision about what they want or need to do with their career, to actually help them to move out of homeostasis and to make a new decision. Now, this isn't to force them to make that leap, but to, perhaps they've figured out that something's not right, they don't know what it is and they don't know what to do about it. So that's where the coach can help them to figure out their own stuff in order to make an ending of some kind. So the psychological side of endings is around deconstructing the old, recognizing the losses and celebrating the endings. And doing all of these things, picking the old apart, keeping what you want to keep of the old, taking it with you, but also knowing that you're leaving some things behind. And sometimes there's a grief process that goes on as you leave those things behind. I recognize that for myself as I left my old role, leaving the people behind. Even leaving my IT function behind, no longer having people who could help me with my computer issues. There was a bit of grief going on there. I know that sounds a bit extreme, but I was thinking about all of the things that I was losing, and it was good to work through all of that and recognize what I really was losing and perhaps needed to replace in some other shape or form, but also figure out what I really needed to leave behind, what wasn't serving me anymore and needed to be just left where it was rather than carrying it as heavy baggage. So there's a process that you can go through in coaching to help people to make good endings. Then what's likely to happen is that people move into this neutral zone, and this is where you have the uncertainty and doubt, the imposter syndrome type of effect, but also just lots and lots of not knowing, and it's a really uncomfortable place to be, but it's not a place to be rushed, because actually this is where we make shifts in our attitudes, we make shifts in our feelings about what is good for us, what we need next. So this is a real learning zone. But it's a reflective place. It's a place where we need time and space and energy to enable this learning to happen at its best. So again, a coach can help a person to slow down, revitalize their energy. I mean, one of the things that we talk about is creating a break between leaving an old role and starting a new one. You need time to revitalize your energy, whether that's mentally, physically, emotionally, and that's what happens in the neutral zone, is you're revitalizing yourself, ready to make a good beginning. And you can only make that good beginning when these things have shifted in the neutral zone. I kind of think of tectonic plates shifting around and finding a new place to sit. And it's a bit like that. When you're in the neutral zone, you're shifting those tectonic plates until you get to a place where you're ready to be in that beginning place. It doesn't mean, as I said, that you haven't already started in a new role, a new organisation or whatever, but actually to make the new beginning psychologically, you need to have gone through that neutral zone. And if you ask a new recruit what would be most helpful to them in their transition, the most frequent response is really to have someone to talk to about moving through this tricky phase. So, perhaps you've tried other options, and perhaps integration coaching of some kind might fill that gap in a better way. And as you can see from the quote here from Pamela McLean, transition is an emotional and reflective process that can take many, many months. It's not over when you shift from one role to another. There's a lot of stuff going on in your head and in your body as you make that shift. Let me give you a case study. This is a real example of somebody I coached who moved from being a country managing director to being a regional managing director. And he came for coaching before he made that shift, because he knew that there were things he needed to think through, really important things about himself and how he presented himself in the first 90 days, how he came across to other people, but also what he wanted to achieve in this new role, how he was going to make sure that he brought his strengths to this new role. But equally importantly, he recognised that he had some endings to contend with and to wrap up in a neat bow, if you like. So he, in his country managing director role, he had really tried hard to create a leadership team that could sustain itself upon his departure. Now, it's not that he wasn't going to be replaced, but he had really wanted to make sure that people were feeling confident that there wasn't a big hole as he left the organisation, that they could make things happen without him. And so that was one of the things that we worked on, was his last words to them as individuals and as a group were all around their capability and capacity to keep the business of the country running smoothly and indeed growing that business. And so that was very important to him, to have a good ending with his leadership team and to thank the people who had supported him, to recognise the people who had supported him before he could then actually let it go. And that enabled him to let it go, because it did take him a bit of time to feel that he was okay with letting them take the reins as well. So we used coaching to help him with that ending for himself and the ending for them. But then there was also how to make the beginning, and he had for probably 2 months, I'd say, in this neutral zone of not knowing, but he came up with a plan in coaching for which stakeholders he needed to talk to, what he needed to ask them, how he was going to work with his new team members, how he was going to show up to them as he came to the regional managing director role. So there was an awful lot of things that we covered in that coaching, which had a very practical element, but also had this psychological underpinning around him making this psychological shift.
Thank you, Claire. So we're now on to the first of our two Q&As. So first question for you both. What's your advice on how best to keep in touch with old colleagues and bosses as they stop being your boss or colleague and you shift and transition that relationship? How can you nurture this so that they can form a strong part of your network?
I think we're at a time in history when the underpinning intent of that question has never been more important, that we actually recognise that the people that we have been with professionally through our career actually are important to our future. This idea of a digital footprint that we now take with us forever, I mean, that wasn't really around 10 years ago. It was not really in our consciousness until probably 5 years ago, maybe for some of us even 1 year ago. And I think we do really recognise the importance of being good leaders, of having colleagues that we stay in touch with, that we know that if we have found our tribe or our community in anthropological terms, that the likelihood is they're going to be important in some way to us, whether that's just as a point of reference or whether it's as a point of introduction, whatever it may be. I don't think we can underestimate the importance of that. I think how we do it, we have choice over. And I think as you were listening to Claire go through that psychological loop just now, I think it's important to let go and then pick up later when you've gone through the new beginning and you want to let people know that you're okay and where you are and what you're doing and how it's going. And that could be 6 months, 12 months, 2 years, whatever. But it's your choice. But to actually do it is important.
Thinking about my own experiences recently, I made a list of all of the people that I wanted to stay in contact with, people who I thought had helped me in the past and who I had helped in the past. So periodically I do connect with each of those people. It could well just be a quick email, maybe sharing an article, or it could be much more than that, a virtual coffee or a face-to-face coffee. Definitely, I've seen the benefit of staying in contact with those people for my future and for their future too.
Okay, thank you. Some good thoughts there. A question about promotion. If you are planning a promotion, how long should you allow for starting the transition for leaving? And this person is assuming that there's more to it than just waiting for a job to be confirmed.
There's lots of ways of answering that question, I think. There's the notice period, have you got? But there's something more fundamental than the kind of legal side of stuff. There's the managing your energy levels and needing to have high levels of energy when you go into this new role. So giving yourself enough time to regroup with yourself, to reflect on what you're taking away from the old role, what you're taking with you, what you're leaving behind. It's really important to have a good, solid chunk of time, not just between the leaving and the starting, as in the leaving date and the starting date, but also thinking about how do you carve out enough time even before your leaving date, because of course there's all the closing activities you need to do in order to be a good leaver and leave on good terms in case you, again, back to this digital footprint about people perhaps wanting to reconnect with you later for other opportunities. So I don't think there's a definitive answer, but I think it's longer than you think it is.
I would agree with you completely. I think it is longer than you think it is, and quite often it's outside of our control. And what comes to mind is that lovely Seneca quotation of luck is when opportunity meets preparation. I think we have to do a hell of a lot more preparation than we actually believe we need to in order to get it right. But at the same time, we have to recognise that opportunities pop up at different times, usually not of our making. So we have to be ready and pre-prepared.
Okay, great. So why don't we move on?
Just to remind ourselves that we're talking about building bridges and how we leave and join organisations well. And I want to spend the next few moments talking about something which is really critical. I'm not suggesting it's the most critical, but you may conclude that it is the most critical tension in this whole process. When we go to a new role in a new organisation, we want desperately to fit in, don't we? For the reasons that you've been hearing. And as the receiving organisation that's hiring you, we want you desperately to fit in. We want you to feel at home. We want you to blend in. We want you to feel comfortable. Here's your office. Here are your car keys. Good luck, all of that sort of thing. This is how we do things here. That's the sort of cultural undertones around it. And all of those things are laudable. They're humanistic and laudable. But the other thing is, we need to ask ourselves, why is it that you've come? Remind ourselves why it was we decided to hire into this role and indeed to hire you into this role. Because actually, that is almost certainly the opposite to the previous set of things I said against the previous slide. We do not want to be that comfortable with you. We brought you in to be disruptive. We want your new way of thinking. We want your new approach. We want things not to be easy for us, for those that you lead and manage. That's why you are here. When you think about the risks associated with change of any type, the key things typically are sponsorship and cultural alignment, that is, your ability to fit in. Whilst at the same time we know that you are going to change things and you're going to meet barriers along the way, and you're not going to like everybody that you're suddenly in charge of, and you're going to want to ring some changes. And we also know that we've got a limited amount of time before we get seduced into this new organisation and we stop asking the question, why do you do things that way? Why do you operate in that way? Why do you negotiate with your customers in that way? We lose that curiosity, not because we're not professional, it's just because that's what happens. Here's the really big question I think that is behind this. For those of us listening to this, how often have we sat down before the new arrival arrives and thought as a group of colleagues, what is the risk management strategy around this new person's arrival and what we know we set out to do? And it was probably weeks, even months, and sometimes years before when we knew that we wanted somebody to come in and do this role. How are we going to make this work? And we ask ourselves difficult questions because I don't want somebody to immediately fit in and be like us. What on earth's the point of that? This has taken a lot of time and a lot of money to get where we are. And I think it's a massive creative tension, a good creative tension. Creative tension is always good in my view. I think it is a creative tension. I think it's one that is mainly on our blind side, both as the individual coming in and the organisation that receives. And it's a sort of part of, if you like, the neutral zone that you were hearing about. Claire has talked about the elements of the programme of integration coaching, and we want to talk in a little bit more detail over the next 10 minutes or so about some of those elements. And I want to talk particularly about this slide, the pre-joining, what happens in the first hours when somebody arrives. May or may not surprise you to hear that it's quite important, I think, for the brain to be in neutral. We have gone through this process of leaving, and there's been an awful lot of hassle involved in all of that, emotional task and all the rest of it, in getting out and getting ready, and we're ready and willing and able for this new job. Actually, what we want to bring is an uncluttered mind. Why? Because we don't want to make any assumptions. We want to be able to listen really actively and well so that we can really make our own minds up about what we hear people say rather than the assumptions that maybe we've had before we have come in. We know that there are huge pressures on the sort of people making these sort of moves within the corporate world, more than there's ever been. One of the things that Claire and I talked about is, what's the best day of the week for somebody to join? And we conclude it's probably Thursday, maybe Wednesday, definitely not Monday. Why? Because Monday is the first time after probably quite a hectic weekend since you last were working or have just returned from holiday, or it's the last day of the children's holidays or whatever. Monday's a bad time for somebody to start in a new organisation. Which day of the week do you have your executive meetings on? Mondays, typically. Why would you want a new starter to come straight into that sort of organisational frame? I would suggest to you it is not the best. It might feel like it, or you think it's the best, it's probably not the best. Think about those first hours that they come in. Think about where it is that you want them to go geographically, to what meetings, who to meet, who to spend time with. There's masses of choice. And most times, looking back on my career, I'm not sure that we always did it right. What we're trying to do with this individual is to allow them, as Claire said, the time, the space, and the energy. And I would add to that, to pick up the rhythm and the pace of the organisation that they're joining. And the third case study is one that actually affected me a little while ago. I was given on arrival 3 pages of acronyms. Now some of you will say, oh, I've seen this before, that works quite well having acronyms. And yeah, it is. But this is the way I was allowed to go about it. It was like a mystery tour of colleagues around a site. And my colleagues were instructed by the director, my boss, not to tell me anything about the acronyms. They would just allow me to know who it was I could go and find out from. So I had to pick the phone up or literally walk across somewhere with a map and knock on somebody's door and say, my name's and I've just arrived and I hear that you can tell me about. It reminds me on reflection of what Stephen Covey said about seek first to understand and then be understood. My peers, my boss, checked out every day for the first 3 weeks. How are you going? There was no expectation on me to do anything other than to assimilate, to, if you like, turn their investment in me into something. They didn't expect any payback at that stage because they knew that what I was doing in those weeks would really pay dividends because, you know, I understood the business before I understood my job, if that doesn't sound too wacky. I understood what was going on in the business. I met lots of people. I understood who they were, what they were doing, and what their intentions were, and I had the opportunity for my face to be known to them, so that when I went to places like the canteen, they knew who I was. A hell of a lot of people knew who I was in the first 3 weeks, more than any job I'd ever done before or indeed since. And the relationship between me and my contribution through my team to the wider organisation could not have been stronger.
So let's talk about the first 90 days then. So you've already had your first hours, your first days. Really, this first chunk of time is all about getting very clear about the contribution that is expected of you, the contribution that you want to make. How do your strengths match the problems that need to be fixed around here? So all that good stuff around relationship building that Simon was talking about there is absolutely vital at this time. Understanding what the stakeholders are expecting of you, building relationships with each of those, figuring out who are the people with the most influence, making sure that you talk to them and get their perspectives. Coaching through the first 90 days tends to focus on these kinds of issues. And then the next 90 days will move into the kinds of early wins that you can make. How do you make good decisions in this culture? So remember, you're good at decision making. You did that in your last organisation, but this is a new context. And so these second 90 days are all about making the best decisions in this culture, not the ones you might well have made previously. And then also at this point, aligning the people, the structures, the processes, the technology. So all of the things in the blueprint that will enable you to achieve the strategy of the organisation. Shifting things around, shifting people around, making sure that the processes are changed, or perhaps start to change those processes in order to achieve the things that need to be achieved. So remember, you're here as a disruptor. This new person has been brought in to do things differently, not necessarily the way they've already been done, and doing them in a way that is sustainable in this culture as well. So the second 90 days is really about bringing to bear everything that you learned in the first 90 days and making some decisions, some changes around what needs to shift. We've highlighted how that fit is sensitized, and by that I mean you're bringing your best self into a new culture. So the fit is important for this culture. It's not about fitting in, though. It's about standing out and recognizing that you're bringing your best self into this new culture. And as a result of that, being able to achieve higher performance more quickly and being more confident that you are able to make the changes that are needed, and not having this underlying doubt about the imposter syndrome and, really, am I honestly the right person for this job? Which, of course, all those kinds of thoughts lead to the attrition that you don't want to have when you've invested so much. So, your return on investment for integration coaching is about getting that confidence of the individual higher, such that they feel that, yes, I have made the right decision. I am in the right place, I can achieve what needs to be achieved, and I have the support to do that. And as a result of that, you have a much lower risk of derailment.
Okay, thank you, Claire. We have 2 requests for advice on some specific and really interesting situations. So I'm going to have a go at trying to get these across. The first is about a job offer and whether to essentially take it or not. Should I take a job that has a lower pay, lower compensation, in a company that is great but is smaller than the current one? I'm not satisfied with my current role, and it seems like this next position could be perfect for my future. Currently, I'm head of division. That's head of trade marketing, and it's sort of an advisory type of role. And the next job which I'm being offered would be with an international company as a regional development manager. So I would be in charge of working alone with distributors across the Balkans, and it would be a move into a more general management role. So any thoughts?
Thank you, Nice. Thank you, questioner. The first thought that comes to mind is how context-driven these things are. So to ask our advice, particularly if you're saying should I, shan't I, a bit binary, is really tough based on limited information. But what I heard you say was that this could be perfect for my future. And my suggestion to you would be to ask yourself why you have just said that. You must have a view of what your future is and what are the things that need to be so in order for you to be able to say, this looks perfect for my future, particularly when you're in the same breath saying, I'm not satisfied where I am. Now, the pay thing, is a bit of a trade-off, and only you can judge how important the pay issue is for you. But if you're moving from I'm not satisfied to this looks like it could be perfect for my future, it sounds to me as if the decision is a bit made, actually, already, without knowing everything about you. The company looks great. It's smaller than the one you're in. I would say look at its histories. Look at the smaller one that looks great. Why do you make the conclusion that it is great? Probably because there's something in it that makes you feel confident that there is going to be mileage in this company, and that as it grows and as the water levels rise, you could go with it, which could also make you wealthier in the doing. There's a lot of indications from the small amount of data that you've given that it could be a good move.
I would also add that we can never be 100% sure that a move is going to be 100% brilliant. There will always be things when we get there that we could not have predicted, and the culture may not be as it was described to you at interview, and at the same time I think we can do a lot for ourselves in researching, in asking to talk to people in the organisation before we make a decision. Any kind of research that we can do in order to check whether this new place really does meet our criteria. And of course that means we need to know what our criteria are first, as Simon said. So if you have a list of what your perfect future looks like, is this going to be a good stepping stone to that perfect future? You can only judge that if you've got some criteria by which to judge it.
Just one further point, I would check out the boss really hard. Is this somebody that you want to work with and for? And are you going to learn from? And if that feels right, then, that's another important component for you.
Okay, great. Another question and situation about someone joining a startup business. I will be joining a startup business within an organization next month. I am expected to hire all of my staff to set up the office and everything else that you'd expect in this type of situation. What should be my key focus in the first 90 days? And the role is as a country manager.
I would not jump straight into hiring in that first 90 days, even though there may be pressure to do so. I think those first 90 days are all about figuring out what is needed in those new hires. And you will be in a perfect position to figure that out, being a newbie yourself. You'll be seeing things with fresh eyes. You'll have other people there to talk to about what's working so far in the startup, what's not working, what are the gaps. So that's in terms of the hiring. I would say stall on that. You need to get yourself acclimatized and psychologically adjusted before you can make good decisions on behalf of hiring other people.
I don't think I'm a long way from that. I would really focus on what the startup's trying to do in terms of customers and its products and or service, depending what it is, the targets. Where are you going to make money? Where is it making money? How would you make it in this country that you're about to set up? I think that's definitely route one. Route two will be, well, it's probably in parallel now, how am I going to build the infrastructure, which could be an office and it could be, technology and all of that. That comes as part of it, and probably the startup, if it's already started in other places, may well have some sort of blueprint that you can follow. And I am with Claire. I think the people come then. I think you need to know enough to be able to really market this strongly, not just to your client base that you want to inevitably build, but to people that will want to come. And you want to hire people who are difficult to get because they're good. You don't want people just because you need bodies. So from that point of view, I think I completely agree with Claire that whilst it's very easy to run to that, I wouldn't run to it too fast. I would bide your time. But at the same time, keeping your networks open and, be talking to people, but don't rush it.
Okay, great. Thank you very much. Some really, really useful comments and advice there. So thank you everyone for joining us. If you'd like to find out more about what we do, or you would like to ask Claire or Simon any other questions about this webinar or anything else, then do feel free to contact Claire or Simon directly. For more career advice and food for thought, do take a look at Claire's brilliant blog, Being Sunbeam, and also take a peek at our PI career advice blog as well. So thank you again for joining us today, and we hope to see you on the next session.